by Cáel. Chapter 3. The ride up to the war room always made Cáel jittery. Every time he held a 50-50 chance that Dylan would have a new mission for him, another outside experience, destined to put him in the heart of it all. Most people called it a catastrophe, a tragedy, but Cáel viewed the outbreak as the chaos that had followed as utopia. He'd been dying of boredom in that clinically scrubbed, blindingly white center, and the first thing he'd done once he had the chance to leave was burn it to the ground. His therapist had told him he'd needed to find something constructive with which to occupy his time, focus his energy on a way to help others, and direct his rage into something healthy, like exercise. Check all of the above. The outbreak had been his cure. He often found it amusing to wonder if one of said doctors hadn't organized it specifically for him. Boredom still came in waves, though. The last few months had been difficult. Nothing on the radios, but if he'd learned anything from the last 6 years of doing something he felt born to do, it was that these things came in groups. Once they found one, more were bound to follow, and soon. The girl who'd come back from this last mission was a rare find, especially after so long. Someone still willing to hope. She was the kind who could help the city. Cáel needed to pass through the war room to get to the hangars every trip he took outside. Damien had informally banned him from lingering after one of the techs had set him off, but the idiots had had it coming. "So, what are the techs?" the girl asked, breaking the perfectly comfortable silence. "They do all the mechanical things around here," the man grinned in response. "You built that radio from nothing more than a cardboard box and a few wires. I thought you might like to meet them." While it was the excuse he gave the girl for his admittedly unorthodox behavior, he wouldn't lie to himself. He had an alternative agenda for her. She was going to help him play a game with his favorite human. Cáel felt a grin tighten on his face as it tried to stretch too wide. The girl wasn't scared of him yet. She was interesting. Our resident lab rat practically built it from the floor up, with an elastic band and a pair of pliers. I think you two will get along just fine. He sounds like a genius, she chuckled shyly. Cáel didn't neglect to notice that she probably didn't understand half of what he just said, but she seemed smart enough to pick up on a few things. "I just built a basic radio. What makes you think I'll fit into your war room?" "It's either that or somewhere else," he responded with a shrug. "I'm giving you a chance to start at the top of the food chain here, so do try to make a good impression." He winked at her humorously, and she smiled back at him with a tired laugh. The elevator doors slid open, and Cáel walked confidently into the war room. Monitors lined up in neat little rows jutted out of the floor on poles, while the few techs, which the city had, walked haphazardly between them. It fascinated the scout, how they always seemed so busy doing nothing. They gave him a wide berth, and even slowed in their activities when they realized he had no intention of simply passing through. It made him giddy that he made them so uneasy with his presence. Yet not a single one of them would approach. Not one of them had the balls. "What are you doing here?" Cáel turned to the voice and smiled sweetly at the young tech, who was also a first, the only one of his kind. The silly little names these people came up with. Dylan pushed his glasses more firmly onto his face, and a lock of sandy brown hair fell into his eyes. It was getting long, but the look somehow suited the soon-to-be 21-year-old, along with his worn skinnies, bare feet, and a grey jersey that insisted on barely hanging onto his shoulders. Cáel had found it for him back in the day, long before they had even found that university. Threadbare and practically falling apart, Cáel wasn't sure why he liked the fact that Daniel kept it. "Labarat, we were just talking about you," the scout greeted happily. "I come bearing a gift." He stepped aside, and the girl waved stiffly. Honestly, he'd asked her nicely to make a good impression. "Dylan, this is Ndidi Amaka. Ndi, the boy genius himself," he introduced the two. "She's the one who built the radio that sent us tonight's distress call," Cáel smiled. Cáel's smile tightened when the young tech did not seem impressed. "You said it was a sophisticated signal, and you're short-staffed. Thought you could use her. Dylan gave the man a suspicious once-over before scanning the girl up and down. He sighed, and a small smile crept onto his face. Cáel's own grin couldn't be held back. He liked her. Dylan, he introduced himself, since Cáel seemed to be in one of his nickname moods. It's nice to meet you, Nindi. I'm sorry he brought you here so soon after your rescue. I'm sure you must be tired. I'm glad he did. The girl smiled sweetly, barely holding back a yawn. It's impressive. Dylan preened a little under the praise. Do you think you'd like to work here? He asked. Once you've settled in. Nindi shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting around the room of wires and motherboards. What exactly would I be doing? She asked. Cáel liked that she asked questions. He could tell that Dylan liked it too. Our primary function is to develop ways of making the city operate smoothly and listen for distress signals from survivors like you. He pointed her to the screens, and she saw maps, infrared overlays and lists. Outdated radios that must have been built before she was born covered just about every table, and wires in patched insulation tape snaked across the floor in haphazard patterns. We run the city from here. Keep it running so nothing malfunctions. We help the scouts when they go out on missions, or the foragers when they go shopping, and we keep tabs on what we need from the outside. We monitor MIMF activity on a large scale, and our blacksmiths create, maintain, and enhance our weapons for our scouts. Does any of that interest you? By the look on her face, something most certainly did. Weapons? Dylan gave Cáel a knowing look, and the scout smiled brightly. I'm beginning to understand why you like her. The younger man beckoned them to follow him to a table on the far side of the room, and Cáel let the girl go first. It was laid out with strange mechanics. The components she probably recognized, but the assemblage, she'd never seen that before. How much do you know about Cebus cells? The tech asked curiously. They were discovered by Bravery Smith, just in time to stop World War III, she began prattling off, her eyes never wandering from the new technology set before her. They basically replaced electricity overnight, because they could supply nearly unlimited energy. The main component in them comes from a crystallized gem, formed by the compression of sap from Varroa trees? Yes, that's exactly right. Dylan practically beamed at the girl. Well done, Cáel congratulated her sarcastically. You have a grade 7 knowledge of basic fuel cell batteries. I expected a little more. Dylan glared, but said nothing to the scout, turning his attention back to the girl instead. Cáel didn't like that. We discovered, through trial and error, that the virus that caused the outbreak only affected people with an O blood type. Initially, that is. A bite from a MIMF can infect another blood type human, but only because it has already bonded with the O blood, the universal donor. At least, that's Doc's current theory. The best way we know to kill them is by the scouts infecting the creatures with their own blood. The nature of the virus is incredibly violent and fast-acting. The antibodies in our blood cause a rapid response in the virus to turn inward and kill the host. What does that have to do with Cebus cells? The girl frowned in confusion. Well, since their main component is organic, the blacksmiths found a way to link machinery, powered by a cell, to the human body. It's all quite fascinating, you see, the way our physiology interacts with... He's being modest when he says blacksmiths. Cáel interrupted the lecture, that he was convinced would put the girl to sleep out of sheer boredom. Dylan chose to ignore his fellow first, but he did hold the theoretical science lesson in favor of picking up a chunk of machinery from the table. He slipped his hand inside as he began to show her. This is a gauntlet. Most of the scouts use one. There are needles inside which collect blood from the user and converts it into ammunition when the gauntlet is activated. Nindi looked one part enthralled and one part disgusted. But with a Cebus cell as its primary power source, wouldn't it stay active continuously? That's the other side of it, Dylan said proudly. It had been his idea after all. And there it was. Cáel wasn't the only one with a minor ego. He loved watching Dylan when he was explaining these things to people who actually got it. It had taken the tech a good 4 or 5 times spelling it out, before Cáel had had to stop pretending he couldn't grasp the concept. Dylan had finally degraded his explanation to danger, on, no danger, off. Because the cell is organic, we created a system where the cell can lay dormant until the user is under threat, the tech explained, his excitement building at her obvious interest. How? She sounded so curious. Cáel would need to keep an eye on her. The curious ones always found some way of getting into trouble. Maybe he could help. However, her awe at this now basic knowledge was becoming tedious. He wanted this conversation to be over, for Dylan to give his approval for the girls to begin training, and for Nindy to leave them alone. Time to speed things up. Cáel stepped up behind the brunette and wrapped his arms around his waist. The gauntlet instantly whirled to life, and the little geek gasped as the weapon activated. Spikes in hormone, adrenaline specifically, kickstart the weapon, Cáel explained, speaking into the side of Dylan's neck, even as his hands rubbed gentle circles over the boy's stomach. The needles insert, blood drops into the chamber, and then firing is as simple as pulling a trigger. Okay, so he'd picked up more than he let on. But he had been using the same technology for 4 years. How could he not know how his own weapons worked? Indy looked confused, but it was overshadowed by her curiosity at the never-before-heard-of technology. As utterly amazing as it is, she said, her eyes wandering back to the table and then back to the active gauntlet, it seems like an awful lot of effort to go through for a solution that can be achieved with a gun. It's
Bullets
more
run out,
effective, Clive answered shortly. Dylan retaliated, clearly annoyed with the scout, but doing nothing to discourage him. He knew Cáel was obviously trying to make him uncomfortable. Regardless of the fact that it was working, Dylan didn't want to give him the satisfaction of knowing he'd succeeded. A bullet to the head will kill a memph, Cáel explained. But what if you miss? They wouldn't even notice an injury to the arm or chest until after a kill. His fingers trailed up and over the tech to point out the different hit points as he spoke. With gauntlets, even a misfire can stop them almost instantly. Nindy thought back to earlier that evening. She'd seen the memph Silas had shot, watched it writhe and scream until it had become still. She thought it was some kind of poison. It might as well have been. What about yours? She asked, her focus once again on the scout that had brought her to this place. Yours is different. I prefer a more personal approach to dealing with our planet's little infection, Cáel answered smoothly. Gauntlets can leave such ugly scars. He pulled the cell from the gauntlet on Dylan's hand, and it powered down, before gently pulling it off. Indy watched as little red droplets formed on each of Dylan's fingertips. He'd barely worn it for more than a few minutes, and his hand had already begun to turn blue, veins pulsing to the surface in a desperate attempt to not collapse. It was horrid. So, Ndidi Amako Basi, Cáel hummed, placing the weapon back on the table and offering her the warmest of smiles. You interested in a job? Dylan had to scoff at Cáel's theatrics. The girl's answer had been clear from the moment she'd stepped into the room. He would definitely be seeing more of her.